Good afternoon. My name is Bert Hoffman. I welcome you to this special Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy Asia Thinkers Seminar. I am the director of the East Asia Institute at NUS and also a professor of practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School. It's a great pleasure for me to chair today's discussion on the theme of COVID-19. How will increased tension in US-China relations affect the region and the world? And I'd like to acknowledge support for this seminar from the Singapore Global Network, which is a division under the Economic Development Board. We hope to have about 1,300 viewers online, which is fantastic. It's also a bit complex. I can't reach out to you individually. So if you would like to ask questions, please do so through the comment section on the Facebook page. I'm sure people know what that means. And if you can, specify whom you'd like to address the question to. On today's seminar, look, the COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost, of course, a human tragedy, and we are more than 3.5 months in. There is 3 million people that have been known to have been affected by the disease, and more than almost 200,000 people have died of the disease. And as I said, we are not through it yet. The measures needed to contain this pandemic have also affected the economy gravely. And the IMF projections, which came out 2 weeks ago, project that this year will be the worst year on record since the Second World War. The decline in economic activity, as projected, will be worse than the global financial crisis 12 years ago. This would be a great time if superpowers were to work together, if China and the US were to work together and help the world solve this problem, because it is a truly global problem. Unfortunately, COVID-19 seems to be more of a catalyst to increase the tensions between China and the United States. What that means for the world, what it means for finding a solution for COVID-19, but more broadly, what it means in the longer term for the world economy and for global and regional cooperation, we discuss today. To discuss these questions, we got a fantastic panel. And to start, we have Mr., he doesn't want to be called professor anymore, Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He's the former founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and a former senior diplomat for Singapore. We also have Professor Kong Yuan Fung, the vice dean of research of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Li Ka-shing Professor in Political Science. And last but not least, we have Professor Alicia Garcia Herrero. She is the chief economist of Natixis Investment Bank, but she's also an adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and a senior fellow at Bruegel Institute in Brussels. Kishore, you have just published a book with the provocative title, the usual provocative title, and I see a copy behind you, Has China Won? Obviously, you wrote this before the pandemic started, but what is your take on how this pandemic will play out in this very big fight, this competition between China and the United States? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bert. And I want to say it's a pleasure to get together with you and my friends Yun Fong and Alicia to have this discussion. And I want to thank Dean Danny Kwa for once again inviting me back to the Lee Kuan Yew School, the school that I'm very fond of. And I want to begin by saying that I would have been very happy if the United States and China had decided that since they both face a common enemy, COVID-19, and since the enemy of your enemy is your friend, I would have been very happy if the US and China had said, let's take a strategic pause, let's focus on COVID-19 and fight this together. it would have been very good for the world, would have been very bad for my book, because it would have shown there's no more a contest. Sadly, the opposite has happened. And as a result, what COVID-19 has done is to actually aggravate the US-China geopolitical contest when it should have actually calmed it down. And so sadly, it has confirmed the fundamental thesis of my book that a major geopolitical contest has broken out between US and China. So what my book tries to do, and here in some ways I'm trying to be helpful to the United States, because I say in my book that the United States has made a fundamental strategic mistake in launching this major geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And actually the man who gave me this insight was Henry Kissinger at a lunch in New York that I had with him 2 years ago. And I believe that it's in America's national interest to work out such a comprehensive strategy and to build on the advice that Sun Tzu very, very wisely gave. He said, know thyself, know thine enemy, fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles. And what my book shows, number one, is that the United States does not know itself. Now, we all know about the great strengths that the United States has. In fact, I begin the book with a fictional memo to Xi Jinping documenting all the strengths that America has. But at the same time, America has developed some structural problems. As Danny Quah has documented, it's the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. At the same time, America has become a plutocracy, as I demonstrate. And America has become a society that is incapable of making U-turns and adjusting to new realities. For example, if they're serious about China being their number one adversary, what they should do is stop fighting in the Middle East, but they can't stop. So that's an example of the rigidities that America has accumulated. And at the same time, the second part of Sun Tzu's strategy is know thine enemy. And most Americans know very well all the structural weaknesses of China. And China, as you know, like any other society, has got many weaknesses, many challenges, and they're real and they have to deal with them. But what many Americans are not aware of are some of the fundamental structural strengths that China has developed. I mean, one example I give is that the Chinese Communist Party, and I know this is a very controversial thing to say, has effectively become a meritocracy where the best and brightest join it. And when I was in Columbia University 2 years ago, my research assistant was a graduate student, and she said when she graduated from high school, she was so sad that she was number 2 in the school, because if she had been number 1, she could have joined the Communist Party, right? So that's an indication of the best and brightest joining the Communist Party. And at the same time, the Americans must recognize that the return of China is the return of a strong civilization, which was the number 1 economy in the world from the year 1 to the year 1820. So the return of China is perfectly natural. It cannot be stopped. So at the end of the day, my advice to both the United States and China is, please think again. It'd be better for both your people if you cooperate, especially now against COVID-19. Thank you.
Thanks, Kishore. And I'll come back to you just to ask you later on whether this strategic pause is still feasible and what needs to happen to get there, because I like the notion very much. But let's first talk about the economy. Part of the fire, so Kishore said, well, COVID-19 has added fuel to the fire of the strategic competition. Well, part of that fire is the economy. And part of this fire was the decoupling that some in the United States foresaw as a strategic future for China and the United States. Alicia, tell us, what does COVID-19 add to this equation?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with Kishore that this is really just going to put more fire into the strategic competition between China and the US. But it's also going to add more fire to that idea of decoupling. And my impression is that it might come from both sides, because it's going to become more and more obvious to China that the decoupling is unavoidable. We may talk about interdependence. So, you know, I would use the word decoupling more carefully, in the sense that there's no such thing as full decoupling. It just can't happen. But we're going to see increasing difficulties in the way we run that interdependence. And this is just part of that demonstration of the strategic competition. So we've moved from the very obvious trade war, which was basically dealing with the surface, meaning import tariffs, to a more complex impact of that trade war, and increasingly COVID-19 on the value chain, on the global value chain, on that centricity that China has played for a long time in that global value chain being basically diminished, not only by the US, Japan is a very good example, even the European Union, simply because it's become crystal clear that the dependence on China's centricity of the value chain can also bring some problems if push comes to shove. And this is, of course, medical devices and other very, very obvious cases, such as the automobile supply chain, for example, at the peak of the Hubei's part of the COVID-19 outbreak. So beyond global value chains, there's something that, frankly speaking, not even in my worst nightmares I could have imagined, which is the deglobalization of people-to-people movement, which we're seeing in a way, of course, forced partially by COVID-19, if we may want to put all of the blame on COVID-19, but I think beyond COVID-19. So we can think about the way students may be shifting from the US elsewhere, the way workers in Europe may be shifting. This is beyond China. So, you know, we're seeing some structural characteristics of people-to-people deglobalization that go beyond China, but will certainly affect China in its talent pool, in the way it reacts or it relates to the US and I would argue the West more generally. And of course, the tech strategic competition we had been seeing during the trade war is there to stay. We just have very, very obvious cases or continuous cases of this type of deglobalization, or let's call it two ecosystems that increasingly do not coexist, but exist on their own. And finally, a very, very tricky and very dangerous type of deglobalization that we may be seeing as a consequence, or I would say accelerated by COVID-19, although not started, is financial disintegration. And in particular, the decoupling of China's companies listed in the US, let alone US investors tapping the Chinese market. We're starting to see signs that this might be increasingly dangerous from both sides. So in a nutshell, from trade to global value chain, from global value chain to people, and tech in the midst of it, plus potentially financial deglobalization. So yes, I do think COVID-19 has brought lots of, I would say, unintended consequences, or maybe intended. That's the whole point. We don't really know whether this is just coincidentally an opportunity for the US and China to keep on pushing into those two ecosystems that they seem to be more comfortable with at the current juncture.
Thank you, Alicia. Yuan Feng, as they say here in Singapore, if two elephants are dancing, the grass gets trampled. But do you see an upside for the region? Do you see some of the, what in your view is the fallout of this big strategic competition? What's the fallout of COVID in this context? But do you see an upside for the region as well?
Thank you, Bert. Upside, probably very tough. Let me focus on the downside first then. And I'd like to try to get to your question by making 3 points. The first point is about the timing and the political strategic context of the COVID-19 crisis. The timing of this pandemic sucks. There is never a good time for any pandemic, right? Especially one on the scale and with the mortality rate that we are seeing. But being inflicted by it now, it's like being whacked by what I call a triple whammy from a geopolitical point of view. The pandemic couldn't have come at the worst time for US-China relations. First whammy is the year-long trade war that has strained US-China relations, and the pandemic, as all of you say, have made matters worse. And that is one reason why US and China has found it so difficult to cooperate. Second, the trade war itself was a symptom of a larger dynamic, namely the shifting balance of power from the West to the East, something that Kishore has done so much to document. The US reaction to this can be seen most starkly in the security strategy document of 2017 and the defense strategy document of 2018, where the US has basically identified China as the strategic rival. Crucially for the US, this is a rival that espouses values inimical to the core values of the US, and for that reason, it has to be confronted. Third whammy is we are 6 months away from a US presidential election. And these 3 contextual factors lead me to my second point. As the curve flattens, people will ask, what happened? There will be enormous pressures in the US and perhaps Europe to assign blame and to seek accountability. The blame game will take on an extremely impassioned character because of the huge casualties and the economic havoc. If we look at the US, over 20 million people have lost their jobs, 1 million infected, with 56,000 victims. This is about the same number of Americans who were killed in the Vietnam War, except that in the case of Vietnam, it happened over 10 years, whereas for COVID-19, this is occurring in the space of 4 months. So I expect a huge reservoir of accumulated anger in the months ahead that will be directed at the source of the pandemic. A key weapon that the Republican Party and Trump will turn to is to deflect blame, focusing on allegations about China covering up the pandemic and not being transparent about the casualties. Expect this blame game to intensify as the US elections approach. And even Joe Biden, the current forerunner, the Democratic Party nominee, I think will have trouble sidestepping this. The main danger of the blame game, however, is not that it will lead to direct US military confrontation. Rather, it will make relations so tense and trust so low that it could spark a larger conflict. And that leads me to my final point, the implications for Southeast Asia. I think it leads to the unwelcome dilemma of being asked once again to choose between the US and China on the issue of whether to assign blame, and if so, who's to blame. As many know, in recent years, most of the ASEAN countries have repeatedly said they do not want to be put in this position of having to choose between the US and China. But as the cases of the TPP, the AIIB, the BRI, and Huawei 5G have indicated, sitting on the fence has become increasingly difficult. Both the US and China will bring pressure to bear on Southeast Asia to side with them in the blame game. I believe the majority will not support a probe or investigation of the kind wanted by the US and its allies. In effect, most in ASEAN will give China the benefit of the doubt. More importantly, for most in ASEAN and beyond, the issue is not whether China covered things up, but once the pandemic took hold, which societies did best in containing the spread and in saving lives. The other performance test will be who will recover faster economically. And while the jury is still out on this one, I would not underestimate America's economic resilience and its technological ingenuity. But if China were to do better than the US on the economic front, its narrative about being the wave of the future will fall on receptive ears in Southeast Asia. I think I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Yuan Fung. Look, I think we can debate this point on what Southeast Asians or what the world thinks about the role of China in containing the virus. I mean, some would actually put the blame on China for losing quite a bit of time at the beginning and making it a global pandemic rather than a localized issue. But let's step back and see whether we can work on solutions. And I go back to Kishore's notion, the strategic pause. Can we have a strategic pause in this competition, the strategic competition between the US and China? And what needs to happen to get there? Kishore.
Well, I must confess to you that since I spent I guess almost now 50 years analyzing international affairs, I find the first rule to follow is to be as realistic as possible. And I believe that the momentum that has developed, especially in the American body politic towards China, and it's quite amazing that 9 in 10 Americans today see China as a strategic threat. That's an amazing statistic. And if you visit the United States today, it's actually very difficult to get any kind of a balanced debate. And so the likelihood is, especially in a presidential election year, you've already seen that both Trump and Biden are out competing to see who's tougher on China. That's very, very clear. So I think we will see a very bad 2020. The best we can hope for is that after the elections are over, and let's say, for example, if Joe Biden wins, I expect the temperature to go down a little bit. The competition will remain, but a Democratic administration, especially if you have the previous officials who used to work with Bill Clinton, with Barack Obama, if they come back, they know you have to maintain a balance between competition and cooperation with China if you want to deal with global warming, if you want to deal with global financial crisis and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I feel very sad making this prediction. There will be no strategic pause in 2020. Let's hope that there's some kind of strategic pause in 2021.
Yuan Fung, you mentioned the US election. Do you agree that that would be an opportunity if there were to be a change in the guard in the US, that over time, at least by next year, there could be a strategic pause or a different direction in this competition? Could be too late for COVID-19, but nevertheless.
I would agree with Kishore part of the way that in the event of a change to a Democratic administration, and with the old hands, people like Kurt Campbell coming back, there will probably be a more moderate approach to China. But I would also like to point out the situation of what I call, there is a structural issue here. And the structural issue is basically China is catching up very quickly with the US on the military, economic, technological, and even cultural front. And that has raised very serious fears in the US of the kind that Kishore just talked about. And what that means is that the structure of the international system, especially in Asia, I see it as already being bipolar, where you have two major powers contending for the leadership position. And that is the thing that is the dynamic that seems to be driving the competition. So this will be a long-term structural competition. But in the end, it does matter who is in office, because there are certain things that the US and China can cooperate together. But with this particular administration, that seems a little bit more difficult.
Okay, well, let's go to those in a moment, not now, but in a moment, on those areas where the US and China can cooperate, but also what role ASEAN can play in this as a regional organization. But let's first go to Alicia, because look, the cooperation, in a way, aside from the to and fro on who caused what on COVID-19, the cooperation on the economic side hasn't been that bad. The G20 came together 2 weeks after the WHO called for a global pandemic, and they put together a package which was amazing. Mind you, it took 6 months. It took 6 months in the global financial crisis before the G20 got together and went for a coordinated approach. How do you see that? Is on the economic side, is there more cooperation possible than on the geopolitical side, the strategic side?
Well, first of all, while agreeing that if our bar is 2008, we're okay on global cooperation. We have had quite a few conf calls. Unfortunately, the latest has been canceled, so it doesn't really necessarily show that optimism. But beyond that, I think the measures, yes, the 5 trillion, it was just an adding, basically, national fiscal stimulus without, by the way, a number for China, which we are all still waiting for. So, it does point to the fact that the two major hegemons aren't necessarily cooperating within that framework. That would be, first of all, my take on the G20. And the very obvious case is the very needed recapitalization of the IMF, which we're barely discussing, and where I don't think we'll have, much agreement, as the US will probably be very reluctant to accept this anytime soon. So on global international cooperation, I would be more cautious, but I would add to the complication that I think both hegemons are looking at how weak the other side is in the light of a structural deceleration, which both are going through in different ways. So how much that structural deceleration will be pushed further by COVID-19 is the $1 million question from both sides. Will China be weaker, or will the US be weak? Both will be weaker, but how much weaker will each side be for the other to take one step further? That's where we are. It's literally game theory here. So I think from the US side, their call is that China's finances, and I frankly quite agree with that. The problem is I also agree with the fact that the US is also putting a lot of, issues on their debt, given what, the massive stimulus they're going through. But from the US side, I actually think that they see China's structural growth as much lower, and as I'm sure you know, because you've been working on this, rightly so. So they really wonder, for how long do they need to put up with this? For how long will China continue to be able to finance that innovation that is indeed catching up, but is basically very much debt-driven? Let's not forget this. So for how much long will China be able to catch up without basically pushing growth so low that their disposable income, which we already see in the data, will no longer grow, and social issues will start appearing, maybe not of the type of the West, but certainly not with the support that the party may have today. So I think that's the bet. Who's going to suffer the most and more quickly? And that is indeed why, in my opinion, both sides are pushing. Both sides are pushing for the other to be weaker, rather than cooperating for both to kind of save the boat, if I may say so.
Yeah, I agree with you that both will come out weaker to some extent. I do believe that if you want the US optimism on how much weaker China will be is exaggerated. And China has its dynamism and its catch-up potential that will be there, irrespective of COVID. But you give the G20 basically a B- or a C+ in terms of cooperation. But more broadly, the COVID-19 is now spilling over into international organizations, and the cooperation within those international organizations, most prominently, of course, WHO, and the US has threatened to withdraw funding. Kishore, what is your view on this? Is the international organizations that really are a product of the US-led international order? Is the US shooting itself in its own foot, or are we expecting a change of mind down the road? Is the international organizations still basically the mainstay for US power?
Yeah, well, I actually, it's very sad that the United States has decided to attack and detach itself from the World Health Organization at a time when we are in the midst of a major global fight against COVID-19, which is threatening all 7.5 billion people in the world. But at the same time, if I had to give one small practical piece of advice to policymakers in Washington, D.C., I think one practical question they should ask themselves is, in the past, whenever the United States took an initiative, remember, everybody would rush to support it. It's what Joseph Nye called soft power. They all rush to support the United States. But what's interesting is that this time around, when the United States, for example, attacked the World Health Organization, no one, not one country, and I think even the European allies of the United States were quite shocked. They said, hey, what's going on here? And even one of the most prominent American citizens, the richest man in America, Bill Gates, said, I'm going to keep on supporting the World Health Organization. And I think, therefore, having launched this attack on World Health Organization, it'd be wise for the United States to do a strategic calculation of which countries are stepping up to support them. And at the same time, frankly, I also hope that wiser people in Washington, D.C. will point out that COVID-19 is not going to be the last virus. There'll be more such viruses coming. It's inevitable. So what we should be doing over the long term is strengthening the World Health Organization. And as I pointed out in my book, The Great Convergence, in 1971, 62% of the financing of the World Health Organization came from compulsory mandatory contributions. You can make long-term plans on the basis of that. Today, that's down to 18%. And that's frankly a result of Western initiatives. We got to restore the funding back up to 62%. And I think if the United States tries to listen to the rest of the world, they'll find the rest of the world actually wants to work with the United States to rebuild the 1945 rules-based order, which I must emphasize was a gift by the West to the world. These are not Asian institutions. These are Western institutions. And fortunately, all the Asian countries want to support it.
Yeah, it is indeed quite. I share your frustration. I am still wondering whether this is by and large a Trump factor or whether this is whether there would be a bilateral consensus in the United States on turning away from the WHO. I doubt the second, but we can come back to that. Yuan Feng, you said so. There's lots of areas where we can still work together as superpowers, but here in the region, ASEAN is the big organization to work together. How has ASEAN been doing in COVID-19? Have they played a role at all in the cooperation? And how do you see them working in the future in the context of this continued strategic competition between the US and China?
I think there was a recent ASEAN meeting in which there was some talk of cooperating on the COVID crisis. But I think we'll have to wait to see what comes out of these suggestions. So, and in terms of, if you look at the other regional initiatives that ASEAN is involved in, from the TPP to what we call the RCEP, what is interesting about these economic initiatives is that the TPP excludes China and the US is not in, right? And the RCEP will include China, but not the US. And RCEP, some people say, may actually come into fruition at the end of this year, although Japan may be having second thoughts about it, given the COVID crisis, because there are other things to attend to. So even on regional economic cooperation, it doesn't look all that promising. And in terms of ASEAN's role between the two superpowers, in the first decade after the Cold War, ASEAN was really in a good spot in playing the role of an honest broker by setting up institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum and so on, where they could bring the two big powers to the region and for them to talk on the side if there are problems and issues, and that really helped alleviate tensions when tensions arose. But my sense is that these days it has become much more difficult for ASEAN to play that role of the honest broker, or be in the driver's seat of something like the ASEAN Regional Forum, because precisely because of the looming geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. In a sense, the US has found its peer competitor, and once that is in train, I think it becomes very difficult for small to middle powers to play a mediator role between the two.
Okay. Well, so we got a few more minutes left for discussion among ourselves. Then we turn to the questions. We got a lot of questions. I won't be able to go through all of them, but it's great to have them lined up. Alicia, I want to turn to you for the final preliminary, and that is on the economy. The question is, are we there yet? Do we see light at the end of the tunnel? Is there a good pathway out of this misery? The second quarter is going to be terrible, but are we going to see improvements after that, and that at least some of those tensions are going to be relieved by a better economy? How do you see that happen?
Sorry, the conversation keeps. I couldn't hear your question well, but I think you talked about it.
When do you see the global economy recover from COVID-19? What is your timeline?
Well, if we just use the IMF World Economic Outlook, it looks like a wonderful V shape, and we'll all be out of this one by 2021. But I need to remind the audience of the assumptions behind, certainly my assumptions behind that V-shaped recovery, which is that first, the West gets out of this situation by this quarter. So, there's not much time left. Basically, in 2 months, we have to be out of any type of lockdown. The second one is that there's no second wave. The third and very, very important one is that there is no such thing as a financial crisis, be it on the corporate space, be it on the sovereign space, or perhaps, why not, a financial institution. I think that the financial institutions probably are less at risk than they were in 2008. But corporates are, because dollar debt in the corporate world is very, very high. And we all know that we're going through a global dollar shortage of some sort. And on the sovereign side, I go back to my point on the IMF and on the 100 countries that have already requested financial assistance, for which there's only $800 billion at hand. So, all of these things have to happen, which to me reduce the likelihood of a V-shaped recovery very, very clearly. And I would add that that's true not only in the West, but that's true also in Asia and in China.
Yeah, the 100 countries asking for assistance, that's 4 times as much as during the global financial crisis.
That's right.
All right. Well, we go to some of the questions, and some of them I just gather as one question, but sometimes I can identify who asked the question. And one is from Jeffrey C. And it's, how should the U.S., and it's really for Kishore, how should the U.S. manage this situation in their interest? So Kishore, you have 1 minute with newly elected President Biden. I'm not very hopeful for Trump, but the 1 minute with elected President Biden, President-elect Biden. What are you going to tell him? How should the U.S. manage this in their own interest?
I would tell him that the United States should ask itself a very fundamental question. Why has the average income of the bottom 50% gone down over a 30-year period? Why is there, as 2 Princeton economists, Case and Deaton, have documented, a sea of despair among the white working classes? So there's some fundamental social and economic problems within the United States, within American society. So the wisest thing that the United States could do is instead of spending $3 trillion on an Iraq war, which went to complete waste, why not take that money and bring that money home and use it to help the American people? So the primary focus of the American government should not be to try and preserve American primacy, because American primacy is making the American people pay a big price. Maybe temporarily even, just focus on the American people, improve their well-being, improve their welfare, and if he does it, he will emerge as one of the greatest presidents ever in the history of America.
Okay, I would take the same advice. Michael 1 has a question, and it really is one for you and Fung. Once the dust settles on COVID-19, will China be more respected or less respected in the region? What is your take?
Several issues will be important in that ledger. One of them would be the extent to which the international community sees China as not having been transparent and not having shared information early enough. So depending on how that judgment goes, it will affect China's standing. So that's one factor that I think, in general, I think there's a sense that China could have been more forthcoming, and faster. So, but the other issues that will be important will be how did China do in containing the pandemic? All right. So if it is, if it is judged that China did a very good job, that will say quite a bit about the performance of the Chinese government, right? And especially in contrast to others who may not have performed as well in terms of a number of lives, saved. So, and then finally, I think there will also be the issue of the recovery from the economic problems. The IMF has predicted that China will probably have a growth of about 1% this year, whereas the US will have minus 5.9%, right? Now, if the IMF is right, then it would seem that China would be onto a stronger recovery. And I think a lot of trading partners in East Asia will notice that, because as the rest of Southeast Asia and East Asia seek to recover, they will have to think about who they'll be trading with. So in that sense, who recovers, who is more resilient economically between the two superpowers will play an important role in their future economic standing among the people who are looking to see who is going to give them their lunch in East Asia.
Practical as always in East Asia, who will pay for lunch? In that context, Alicia, one of the questions here from Fung King Yu is on the WTO. Clearly, just before COVID, we saw the demise of the arbitration panel, or at least a pause in the arbitration panel. There are not enough arbiters to man a panel, and basically WTO out of function at the moment. Do you see them play a role? If you look at the impact of COVID on world trade, it's absolutely astonishingly bad. It's minus 20 to minus 30% in global trade. Can the WTO in this context be a catalyst for reviving trade and reviving growth?
Well, for me, for a long time before COVID-19 and the collapse in trade, I've always thought the WTO was already history, to be frank, the Titanic, I used to call it. So imagine now, I mean, the EU has tried to revive, as you know, the arbitration through its own mechanisms and invite other countries, including China, actually, to participate. But, there's it's very hard to arbitrate trade when trade is collapsing, because it's just, everybody on its own, on his or her own. So I just don't think any type of arbitration is just basically to keep what we had. What we would need to foster trade would be liberalization. And that's something that since Doha we are waiting for. So, since the Doha round. So I don't think that's something you can do in such a difficult time. And I'm sure we learned from the Great Depression how hard it can be. I just want, if you allow me to add something to this idea of China's, the third part of the equation, how China's economy will do, so that others prefer to jump on that boat. Yes, growth-wise, obviously, but of course the base is different, yeah? I mean, China was growing 6.1% last year. So basically the reduction in growth, although it's still bigger for the US, I fully agree, is still very, very massive for China. And in fact, if we just focus on March data, which is very, very scary, to be frank, retail sales have collapsed in China, minus 16%. Real disposable income, minus 4+. So we just have to realize that China may grow, but it might not grow for the rest of the world. Growing is not enough for the rest of Asia. China needs to import. And the key question is, will China import, or will China keep whatever growth is left for its own? So I fear that given the very difficult circumstances China is going through, China will try very hard to keep that growth for itself, keeping very little for Asia. That doesn't mean that the US will do better, but I'm just saying we may have to be realistic about how much China can actually offer to the rest of Asia, at least in the short run, 2020, 2021.
And very, very clear also that China will not come up with this massive stimulus that we saw in 2008 and 2009, which frankly helped restart growth for the rest of the world. It's not going to happen. There's too many domestic problems in China, too many issues with the financial sector, with corporate debt, with household debt. It's going to be much, much more gradual. On that though, on the longer term growth, we have a question from Ernesto Brown. Kishore, you seem quite optimistic about the long term for China. Now, others would say, look, you know, the state-led, centralized, industrial policy guided a model that China has chosen doesn't have a proven history. It has never worked for the long-term growth versus a more liberal, competitive, market-based system. Where does your optimism come from for China?
That's a very good question. But to my friend Ernesto, I would say that reflects a perspective of history that is based on what was the norm for the past 200 years, when the more open liberal societies in Europe and the United States took off and succeeded. But before that, for 1800 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. And I would say that if China tried to come back on the basis of Western formulas on how to run China, China could very well fail. But if China decided to go back into its own history and ask itself, when did China really do well? And the answer is unambiguously clear. That's only when the center is strong that the Chinese people benefit. And when the center is weak, the Western powers that we saw in the 19th century came and trampled all over China. So in the case of China, having a strong central government is a necessary condition for their success. But more importantly, you also have a Chinese government that, number one, for the first time in 4,000 years, is utilizing the brains of 1.4 billion people. For most of Chinese history, a very thin sliver of minds were being used in Chinese history. Now they have 1.4 billion people. And as they have also improved their livelihood so much that if you read my book, I quote a Stanford psychologist which says that if you want a pulse of a society, if you want to feel pessimism, go to the suburbs, the inner cities of the United States. If you want to feel the pulse of optimism, you go to China. So clearly, China is doing things that are fundamentally right. Yes, it can fail, but consider the possibility. Is it safer to underestimate China and then be completely shocked when a suddenly more powerful China emerges? Or is it safer to overestimate China? And if China succeeds, and let me just make a very simple point. If the average Chinese can be 50% as productive as the average American, China's GNP, pure mathematics, will be twice the size of the United States. Now, I believe that the average Chinese can easily be 50% as productive as the average American, maybe even 75%, maybe 99%. So what kind of economy are you going to have? So let's be here. I'm going to emphasize, I'm making very realistic projections. This is not wishful thinking. This is on the basis of a deep understanding of the forces that are driving the revival of China.
Alicia, you see you frowning. Would you agree with what Kishore just said?
I thought you wouldn't see me frowning. That's such a pity. Well, I have to add something as an economist that, first of all, you are absolutely right. Labor productivity in China has been very high, even for China's GDP per capita. So we are all aware of the industrious nature of Chinese, which is great. But there's more for potential growth to continue, because we have to remember, we're talking about a very high base. Yeah, China's potential growth, supposedly, let's say it's about 5. You need that productivity to increase every year. And it's not only labor, it's also capital. And that's where I want to put, most of the emphasis. For that, you need capital to be allocated properly. And it's not really about having a central government only, which you can have with private ownership. You can have, let's say France has a very centralized government, which doesn't mean that you need to go full-fledged with state ownership of every major sector. So I think the key for China to keep that potential growth really is about increasing labor productivity, which indeed is happening, although I have to say it's coming down. And maybe this is because it's increasingly difficult to do better, which is what has happened to the West. So, once you urbanize your population, it's not too difficult to be more productive. Once you're there, how you increase further. But the key question mark is how you make your capital allocation more efficient, how you make your investment more efficient for that growth to remain as high as it has been so far. And there, I'm frankly very pessimistic on China's long-term growth rate. Not because, and I'm not trying to say that's bad news. This is what has happened to every country that has actually developed, including South Korea, including Japan. So it wouldn't be any failure. What I'm trying to say is that we don't need to think of China's failure to imagine a China with a much lower potential growth. It's just a natural process. That's all.
Okay. There's a very famous article by Len Pritchett and others who says good policies are good luck. And you see the rich countries have had a lot of luck, or rich countries had a lot of good policies. Well, you need a combination of both. China still has a lot to grow, needs to grow 4 or 5 times its current size to match, if you want, the per capita income of the United States. So they need a lot of good luck, but they can also make a lot of policy mistakes along the way. We're running out of time. I have one very quick question for you, Anfu, and that's building on the last question. Will the experience of COVID-19 and if you want, how China's handled this, will this be an advertisement for the China model? Will there be a backlash against democracies in the region? It comes from Samantha Wong. You've got 1 minute to answer.
But can you repeat the last part?
Will we see democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and the relatively good performance in managing the crisis by China?
Okay. it is a trade-off between performance and individual liberties. Now, to the extent that there's been a lot of talk about the way that societies like China managed to contain the spread of the virus was through very invasive technologies, right, which allowed the government to track where people were going and so on. It is an issue, I think, for democracies, not just in Southeast Asia, but also elsewhere. But in the end, however, I think a lot of people in Asia will focus on what works. If you can keep the casualties down, I think they will appreciate that. And apparently, this is also happening in Europe, although you hear voices, stronger voices of protest in a way that, you hear less of in Asia because of the focus on the community.
All right. I think this is a question that will be debated for a very, very long time. We're out of time. I have many more interesting questions left. Unfortunately, I have to go to my speakers for the final remarks. And let's start with Alicia.
Well, the ultimate outcome in terms of this strategic competition between China and US will not be resolved out of COVID-19. This is just, although very important, just one more drop in the ocean of a situation that basically is there for us to it's there to stay. We just have to get used to this. And I think ultimately there may be no winner. I think, frankly, in my opinion, this is going to harm the two. People are going to realize that they've put their own interests before the solution to a global problem, which is a pandemic. And therefore, both are going to come out weaker out of this.
Thank you. A very profound conclusion. Yuan Feng, your last words, one minute.
Okay. I think there might be a way out of the geopolitical competition between the US and China. And that's something that was implicit, I think, in what Kishore said earlier. And that is the extent to which the US needs to be the predominant power in Asia, right? And analysts have raised the question whether the US is willing to share power in Asia with the rising power, namely China. And I think that is something that the US has to work through, because if the US is willing to pay less attention to the nature of political systems and treat nation states in terms of them as qua nation states, there might be a way to work out in terms of sharing power and influence in the region. And I don't think China is in any hurry to displace the US as the reigning hegemon.
Kishore, the final word.
Very quickly, I began by talking about why I think it's important for the United States to do a kind of strategic reboot and start its long-term strategy vis-a-vis China. One person that, frankly, Americans should look at very carefully is the man who formulated America's strategy in the first Cold War. His name was George Kennan. And let me just give you 4 examples of advice he gave in dealing with a much more hostile Soviet Union. He said, number 1, focus on our domestic spiritual vitality. That, at the end of the day, is what's going to win the battle against Soviet Union. Number 2, cultivate friends and allies. Very important. Number 3, amazingly, even vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, he said, don't insult them, because we still have to work with them. Don't insult them. And number 4, the most important piece of advice, he said, be humble. And it's interesting, in 1949, George Kennan said all this. I think what George Kennan said in 1949 is still valid in 2020.
So thank you. I suggest we send a very long telegram to both Beijing and Washington on that note. I do think there is still an opportunity to work together, and if not under COVID-19, that triggered the largest economic crisis since World War II, when would cooperation be possible? I've had a great discussion. Thank you so much for the participants. Alicia, Kishore, Yuan Feng. Thank you so much for the great questions that came from the audience, and I do hope to follow up with some of you in person. Thanks to Entre Media for managing this very sophisticated setup that I do not understand. And thanks to the Singapore Global Network, a division under the EDB of Singapore, for supporting the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy Asian Thinker series. Good afternoon, good night, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.